Well, let's see. I want to finish up Roman citizenship, and then we're going to be continuing down to letter D there under socially, and then we may even get a little past that. Roman citizenship primarily is seen, as you already realize now, in the life and travels of the Apostle Paul. Came in very handy for him in that passage over in Acts 22 that we've looked at already. We looked at Acts 16 at Philippi. Another passage that relates to that is in Philippians chapter 3. Paul says your citizenship is in heaven. And to be a part of Philippi, it being a Roman colony, was important. So that's an interesting statement. Then I think that left us with two other things I just wanted to briefly mention we're not going to spend very much time on. The first of these you really can't spend much time on. The latter you could spend too much time on it. The first of those is in Acts 23 and verse 1. Now, this is right after our little section there in the end of Acts 22 where Paul uses to his own gain or to his own benefit his Roman citizenship, something that Christ Jesus didn't have, remember, or maybe he could have been spared some of that flogging, but Paul did have it, and he was spared that because he called on that to deliver himself by. And then in Acts 23, he's before the Sanhedrin. Verse 1, Paul earnestly beholding the council, the Sanhedrin, said, Men, brethren, I have lived. Now this word lived is not the normal Greek word for live. It's an unusual word that means I have lived as a citizen. So probably that's just a play on, that's why he uses an unusual word for live. It's just a play on his earlier claim, that is in the preceding chapter in Acts 22, to Roman citizenship, his claim to Roman citizenship. So that he's now, it's a play on citizenship, but of course now it's citizenship in the religious, spiritual sphere, in that he's lived in God's kingdom as a proper citizen. I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day.
Hallelujah.
So it's probably a play. Now you wouldn't know that unless you knew this is an unusual Greek word here, and it's a word that means lived, but lived as a citizen, not just lived as life, as we normally think of the word, and as the word is normally used, and as it normally appears in the New Testament. So I think, in my estimation, it's probably just a play on his claim to natural this earth citizenship, the preceding chapter where he says, I've also lived correctly as a citizen of another kingdom, and that is in all good conscience before God until this day. That's one other place. I'm just showing you the places where Roman citizenship enters into the New Testament picture. Acts 16, 22, 23, Philippians 3. Okay, we've covered those four passages. And then from Acts 25 through 28. So we're not going to study all of this, but we'll just look at a few verses. From Acts 25 through 28, we have one more side topic to Roman citizenship. It's really not a side topic, it's very important, and that is the subject of appeals. Here is where Paul appeals his case to the emperor. Now remember we said that these Lex Valeria and Lex Porcia, as reconfirmed and reissued in Lex Julia, these laws forbade rods and beheading and beating and imprisonment and all of this business, and they also looked upon the Roman citizen as being someone directly responsible and only responsible to the emperor himself in Rome, if we're after 30 BC. So that no one can try his case unless the Roman citizen gives them that right. He can appeal his way all the way back to the emperor. Prior to 30 BC, he appealed himself to Rome, either to the citizens, to the populace of the city of Rome, or to the Roman Senate, to the senators. After 30 BC and Augustus Caesar taking over and really creating a new Rome, a new Roman Empire known as Imperial Rome, then they appealed directly to the Caesar. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that the one who appeals, because think how many people, if they didn't want to be tried in some outskirts of the Roman Empire, would just say, and they would use the technical phrases in Latin, I appeal to Caesar. Think how many could appeal to Caesar. Now, could the man Caesar, whoever he is, whether it's Claudius or Nero or Vespasian or Titus or whoever it is, could he really listen to all the cases? Well, hardly. A few of those would make it through directly to him. Some of it would have to be dealt with through his ministers. Think of our court system here. Very few, relatively speaking, cases make it all the way through to the Supreme Court. We have other courts to deal with most of the cases. A few of them, you keep on appealing, and you can appeal your way all the way to the Supreme Court. Sometimes you appeal your way to the Supreme Court, and they turn you down. They decide not to hear your case. That means that's the end. You're stuck in your local court, wherever you are from. Well, for Paul, he was going to appeal all the way to Rome. So I have chapter 25, beginning with verse 9, as a reference here to begin with. Now, Paul's already more or less made his appeal to the Sanhedrin and then to the Roman leader in chapter 23 and then in chapter 24. But Festus, the Roman leader, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, "Wilt thou go up to Jerusalem?" He's in Caesarea now, remember. "And there be judged of these things before me?" Now, it appears as though Festus has the right to ask the citizen, does he want to go to Jerusalem? But of course, Paul has a higher right, and that is in declining the request to go to Jerusalem, but conversely appealing his case past Festus all the way to Rome. And Paul said, now he doesn't say in the correct technical terms yet, but we can tell what he's going to be asking for. Paul said, "I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged." Now that was not enough for an appeal. He has to appeal in an official manner. But we can tell, and Festus could tell, what he's leading up to. He said, "I stand at Caesar's judgment seat." That's just letting us know he's going to appeal here in a moment, the end of verse 11. "Where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest." Now, why does Paul not want to go back to Jerusalem to be tried? Remember, Festus said in verse 9, the end of the verse, "And there be judged of these things before me." He was still going to be on trial, not before Jewish authorities, but before Festus. Well, of course, he doesn't want to go back to Jerusalem because that's the seedbed and the hotbed for Judaism and for all of his antagonists, all of those people against him. So, you've heard of cases where maybe because of a case's notoriety, then it's moved to a different location because all the people in that general area are already prejudiced against a certain person or prejudiced in favor of a certain person, and what's going to happen? No fair trial will take place there. Even though supposedly and allegedly people are supposed to be honest and you're not supposed to be biased. You, as one who's called for jury duty, you are to listen to the facts of the matter, the evidence, and then decide. But we know Paul knew human nature. You might try to be fair. Festus might try to be fair. But when you're right in the capital city of Judaism and of all of the Jews, it's going to be difficult to do anything contrary to what the Jews would want you to do. So Paul realizes that. He says, no way. I've already been tried here at Caesar. I've already been tried here at Caesarea, and I've been found innocent, as thou very well knowest, the end of verse 10. And if you think you're going to take me to Jerusalem, then I'll have to use my next prerogative that I have. You see, he's used his prerogative of Roman citizenship in chapter 22 to keep himself from being flogged or scourged. Now he says, I'll have to use the next one, which is appeals. "If I be an offender, have committed anything worthy of death, I don't refuse to die. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them." And here it is. Notice how it's period, and then here's another little sentence tacked on, "I appeal unto Caesar." And Paul may have even said that in Latin whenever he pronounced that. It was more or less expected that any Roman citizen would have somewhat of a command of the Latin language. I don't think I've mentioned that before, so let me mention that, since you might be wondering, well, how could Paul say this in Latin? Now, it wasn't always true, practically speaking. Theoretically, it was supposed to be true, that if you were given Roman citizenship, you should have some type of facility, even if it's small, in the language of the Roman Empire, which officially and judiciously was, of course, Latin. So Paul may have spoken in Latin here. We don't know what he was speaking in the rest of the time here. But he may have spoken in Latin because of the way this sentence is stated, "I appeal unto Caesar." You had to say that in Latin, and that was just the same as granting you the appeal. "Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council," that is, with the Sanhedrin, "answered, Hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Then unto Caesar thou shalt go." So there's Paul's appeal to Caesar. Then in chapter 26 and verse 32, we see something else about the subject of appeal, where once one had made this appeal, you could not go back on it. And that's correctly borne out by the reliable sacred historian Luke. "Then said Agrippa unto Festus. Now, this is King Agrippa. But remember, just because he's king doesn't mean he's above. He's really beneath Festus. Festus is the important authority here. We discussed that earlier in ITP. This man might have been set at liberty if he had not appealed unto Caesar. Then in 27:1, Acts 27:1, he's put on the ship, and he's heading off for a date with Caesar. Last chapter 28, verse 16, we find him finally arriving at Rome. In the last two verses, Luke leaves him after 2 years, still in Rome, waiting for his trial to be complete. Now, in between verses 30 and 31 of Acts, you can stick Colossians, Philemon, Ephesians, maybe Philippians. He's doing a lot of writing. He's not idle while he's there. He's preaching the kingdom of God and teaching those things which concern the Lord Jesus Christ, and some of it came in the epistolatory form, that is, in his epistles, with all confidence, no man forbidding him. And if you look in books like Ephesians and like Philippians, you'll see of Paul speaking of his bonds. He says that I'm in bonds for Christ. Well, that means he's in Rome, and he's there still waiting for his appeal to go through. And another interesting verse would be something like Philippians chapter 1 and verse 13. Philippians 1:13. So that by my bonds in Christ. Well, he's speaking literally of imprisonment, but probably he didn't have chains around him. He's not just speaking of spiritually, I'm the bondslave of Christ, but now in the flesh, I'm a captive of the Roman Empire until my case is heard. So that my bonds in Christ are manifest in all the palace. Maybe it should be translated the Praetorian Guard, which was the highest form of guard in the Roman Empire, and maybe Paul was able to witness to them. Evidently he was, and in all other places. Someone reading the NIV tonight, what does that have besides palace? I doubt it has palace. No one's got the NIV out? She generally does.
The whole palace guard.
The whole palace guard. They give you guard then? It's not italicized? Okay. Well, the technical name is the Praetorian Guard. We'll discuss that in some other context, so, like in a study of Philippians. Okay, well, other things are flitting in my mind like sparrows. Let's see, Ephesians 4, verse 1, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord. Well, he means literally, not just a bond slave, spiritually speaking, but I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord. Then I'm back in Philippians, trying to find all these places. I just know around where it says, I know it's in chapter 2. Well, he's talking about Timothy. Isn't that? Yeah, verse 19, he's talking about Timothy. He says then in verse 22, ye know the proof of him, Timothy, that as a son with the Father he hath served with me in the gospel. Timothy must have been with him then in his first imprisonment there in Rome. Him therefore I hope to send presently, and look at this phrase, so soon as I shall see how it will go with me. Evidently his case now, Philippians must have been written toward the end of the 2-year period. That's why I put it between verses 30 and 31 of Acts chapter 28. And so Paul can tell his case is, it's gone up the list. You get on a waiting list there before your case is heard by the Pharaoh, by the Caesar. And no doubt he recognized it's almost time for him. And so he said, I'm just waiting to see how it will go with me. Then he says in verse 24, but I trust in the Lord that I also myself shall come shortly. He's saying I'm going to send Timothy. But he's saying I'm trusting that, in other words, what he's saying is I'm trusting that I'm going to be delivered. I'm going to be found innocent. And therefore I won't have to send Timothy alone. I'll be able to come with him because they're going to set me free. And then another place, of course, Philemon is written at the same time. So let's see what Philemon has to say over here. I know there's an interesting verse toward the end of Philemon. Where do you get all this stuff? You get this stuff through, one of two sources, either through New Testament introduction, or you get it through a study of the life of the Apostle Paul. You get it either way. I got it through New Testament introduction. Philemon, verse 21. Having confidence in thy obedience, I wrote unto thee, knowing that thou wilt also do more than I say. But withal, prepare me also a lodging. Now he's writing from Rome. For I hope is really the word, not trust. For I hope that through your prayers I shall be given unto you. So he's saying, get my bed ready and make sure I've got a nice pillow and covers there. Have a place for me because I'm going to be there shortly. Now he doesn't know, but evidently his appeal is being worked out, working itself out. And he realizes, or at least has the hope, as he himself said, that he will soon be released. Okay, notice, in other words, there's a positive note in Philippians and Philemon, as though Paul thinks he's soon going to be released, as though Paul thinks he's going to be found innocent. He's in Rome right there, that he's going to be found innocent. Okay, contrast that with 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul's in Rome again, imprisoned again, but it's not the same occasion as Philemon and Philippians. And he doesn't think that his outcome is going to be too positive. Why? Look at a verse like 6. I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. Now, why didn't he say that when writing Philippians? Well, he knew he was going to get out, or thought, or hoped he was going to get out. Now he kind of has some inside information. We don't know whether through some governmental channel or through the Holy Spirit's channel, that now it's over with. He said, I fought a good fight. I've finished my course. I've kept the faith. Then we can jump down into verse 18. Verse 18, therefore, must speak of spiritual deliverance. The Lord shall deliver me from every evil work, and will preserve me unto his heavenly kingdom, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. One cannot construe that into an expression of Paul's hope of release from Roman imprisonment, because the earlier verses at which we had just looked contradict that. Paul seems to think that his outcome is not going to be very positive. He said, I am ready to be offered up. He uses a technical Hebrew Jewish term there for a burnt offering or a drink offering being poured out to the Lord, that his life is going to be poured out, his blood is going to be spilled for Jesus' sake. So when he says that the Lord will deliver me from every evil work, he's speaking of spiritual things. He can't be speaking of the evil work of Roman imprisonment, because we know the Lord didn't deliver him, so Paul would have had some false verses there in his book. Okay, to my knowledge, that satisfies our study of Roman citizenship. Do any of you have any questions about that before we go on? Any on the subject, or make sure it's one I can answer now. Don't ask me one that's too hard. We understand Roman citizenship well enough. Well, that's what we discussed the earlier time, remember? We really don't know how he got. We know he got it by birth. I mean, he said that I was free-born, but the question was, how did his ancestors get that? That's what was our topic last time, if you remember. One of various solutions have been proposed, and only one of those, if any of those, would be correct. And I said perhaps it was through the chief way that people outside of the Roman Empire, outside of being Romans, being Latins, and having ties into Roman government and so forth, one way they could receive is by doing some heroic duty on behalf of the Roman Empire, such as fighting maybe for Pompey, since we know that Pompey came through. If he's going down to Syria and down to Palestine in 64 to 63 B.C., he had to pass through Cilicia. And maybe Paul's relatives, some earlier relatives of his, did something for Pompey, or for someone, some heroic duty, and then upon them was conferred Roman citizenship. And once it's conferred, then all of your descendants automatically have it. Paul, he said, I was freeborn. It still doesn't tell us how Paul's ancestors got it, just how he got it. He was freeborn. That's probably a good guess. Some heroic duty, probably a military duty done for the Roman Empire. Or maybe it could be something like, it doesn't have to be fighting. When I say military, don't think of fighting. Maybe it's just that you take in 20 or 30 Roman soldiers on their march from Rome down into Syria and feed them, give them a place to sleep, kind to them, give them something to drink. And maybe that'd be enough. Definitely at times that was enough to have citizenship conferred upon you then. Maybe it's a time of great hunger for the soldiers or thirst or something, and you take care of them. Maybe you have an inn. Maybe one of Paul's relatives operated some type of inn in Tarsus or in Cilicia or somewhere in Southeast Asia Minor. And therefore you took Roman soldiers in at your own expense. And that's fairly commendable thing to do. On our outline, page 3, then, let's kind of look at what we have to discuss next, because we're through with that whole area of Roman citizenship. Taking us 2.5 weeks, I guess. We're still under social strata, though. We don't move out from underneath that, because we have one more point under social strata that I've entitled family names. Now, this business of family names, then when you jump down to number 4, morals, then when you jump down into big letter B, economically, the occupations, finance, and then culturally, public conveniences, transportation, all of this, education, languages, we've already discussed that many times in many different connections. Some of this is going to be rather brief. I don't see us spending that much time, in other words, between where we are right now and the next big issue on the outline, Roman numeral 4, the religious backgrounds of the intertestamental period. And that's because, as I think I've already earlier intimated, we have another class that we'll study in the future about daily life in Palestine that deals in a lot more detail with some of these questions here. So some of this will just be kind of introducing you to the subject, and a lot more could be said about it than what we're going to say. If you have questions, feel free to ask the questions. I may answer them, I may not answer them. Depends on whether or not my mind tells me that's already in my notes. So, family names. A study of names in the Bible is about like a study of numbers. They're both very interesting, but they can both be very misleading if one looks for some Kabbalistic meaning in numbers or names, as the Jews were very prone to do in the Middle Ages, and, as I found, too many Christians are prone to do even today. Now, there's no doubt about the fact numbers are important in Scripture. Not every number, but numbers are important. God works with numbers like 3 and 7 and 10 and 40, just to think of some of the most obvious ones. You could probably have named those in order. 3 and 7 and 10 and 40. There's just lots of things with 3, 7, 10, and 40 in Scripture. And then let's don't forget 3 sixes together. That seems to be probably one of the most interesting numbers in Scripture. A study of numbers is like, I'm saying, a study of names. A study of names could just go on and on almost indefinitely. What various names meant, why people were named that. And I already have a lot of studies in that area that we'll do in the future. And we've already talked various times about names around here, as it would come up in the Old Testament introduction or in some other place. But I guess what I will concentrate on this evening in the study of the intertestamental period is the subject of differentiation, how families differentiated children that they had versus the ones that their neighbors had, when many times the names are exactly the same. I mean, think, how many Marys are there in the New Testament? How many James in the New Testament? What about John? What about Simon or Simeon? What about all of these offshoots? Judah of the Old Testament, Judas of the New Testament. Judah dropped the H in the New Testament. Jude, a shortened form, J-U-D-E. That's all Judah is, all that is. Judah, Jude, Judas. Judah spelled 2 different ways. Simon, Simeon, the same name. One's kind of a Greek form. Simon is a Greek form of the Hebrew Simeon. We better not get into John. Think of all the Johns, or Jonah, and how you can expand that into various names. Like I said, Mary. There are so many Marys that she gets confusing. We don't even know who the she is under names like Mary. And James, many different James in the New Testament. And yet some type of distinction has to be made. It appears, if you'll turn to Luke chapter 1, verses 59 through 63, that it was, at least in this period of history, that it was just the common practice to name a son after the father or after another close relative, some kinsman, in other words. This is nowhere more clearly borne out than in the story in Luke 1, verses 59 through 63, of John, who became John, but who started off as Zechariah. Why? Because his father's name was Zechariah. Zechariah is a good Old Testament name. It's spelled here in the New Testament as Zacharias. When you go from the Hebrew to the Greek, many times the H was just changed to an S, like Judah Judah, was changed to Judas, Judas. The same name, exact same name. One's a Greek form of the Hebrew term. So this is the account of the birth of course, John the Baptist. It came to pass on the 8th day that they came to circumcise the child. And they, the people, called him Zechariah. Really, it should be Zechariah, not Zacharias, because he wasn't living in New Testament times. He was an Old Testament person, remember. So he would still have the name Zechariah, just that the New Testament was written in Greek. So it ends up as Zacharias. And you have to go back and change it throughout the whole chapter, really. They called him Zechariah after the name of his father. Now that must have been the frequent common thing to do. You got named after your father. And so think how confusing that would be. Zechariah and Zechariah. Now we make it easy today with Junior, the third, the fourth, the fifth. But they didn't have Zechariah Junior, Zechariah the third, or the fourth. It was just Zechariah and Zechariah. Must have been other ways you had to make distinctions up. You could call him Zechariah, the son of Zechariah. And hopefully his grandfather, your grandfather was not named Zechariah, because then your father would also be Zechariah, the son of Zechariah. And his mother answered, and this must have been unusual, you see, and said, "Not so, he shall be called John." John's a good name. They said unto her, look at verse 61, "There is none of thy kindred that is called by this name." So if you want to read the reverse, the implication, you name someone after someone already in your family. And of course, that's popular to do today. Unless you have a name like mine, you don't dare cause your children that embarrassment. Well, someone was asking me the other day, why haven't you named your son, or are you going to name one of your sons Chino? I said, no way. Can you imagine Chino Jr.? What a name. That'd be horrible. Praise God. I like my name. No complaint about it. People, well, they might forget the name. They don't forget you with a name like that. They'll think you're a Jap or a Mexicano or something like that, but at least they remember it wasn't just Mike or Bob or John or something like that. No way, Chino Jr., no way. They said to her, "There is none of thy kindred that is called by this name." And they made signs to his father. Remember, he's this old unbelieving man, because the angel said, "You should have believed me. You'll be dumb until the time comes." How he would have him called, and he asked for a writing table, or really it probably should be tablet, like a wooden tablet with wax on it, and you could make impressions upon it, and wrote. It's not like one of these little things where you peel the paper up, you can write and lift it up and let it down and it would erase itself. And his tongue loosed, whoop, I skipped some, and wrote, saying, "His name is John," and they marveled all. And his mouth was open immediately, and tongue loosed, and he spake and praised God. Now why do we have the end of verse 63, they marvel all? Because that was unusual. When you've got a good name like Zechariah, and you name your son John, and you don't have anyone in your family named John, that was very unusual to do. And that's why it says, and they marveled all. You see, everything is in Scripture for a reason. You just have to read carefully and maybe make a few deductions here, and you can come out with some proper understanding of these matters. So, since families didn't have last names, they certainly did have last names. That's relatively recent for people to have a last name, and even more recent to have a middle name. That's just because matters are a little more technical today than they used to be. And we just can't have in one town of 1,000 people, 700 people named John. It would just drive the town clerk crazy to keep up with everyone. So it's good to have John F.C.Q. Benson or something. Then for sure we won't confuse him. But since families didn't have last names, people who happened to have identical names had to be distinguished in some other fashion. And let me give you several ways, about a half a dozen ways, and we're not exhausting the subject by any means. But I think you'll just kind of find this interesting. I doubt it'll help you out tremendously spiritually, but you'll probably find it interesting. How people with identical names were generally distinguished in Israel. Again, we're talking about Israel in the 1st century A.D. How people were distinguished with the same name. And we'll start with kind of where we are here in Luke 1, and that is with number 1, you could be distinguished by your father. Distinguished by your father. What does, some of verses we'll look up, some if they're just on my mind, the subject or the case, I might just mention it. I'm thinking of Matthew 16 here, although I don't have it down. Whenever Jesus, they go up to Caesarea Philippi, and he asks them, whom do men say that I am? They give the response, but who do you say that I am? Peter says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Then what does Jesus, remember the little statement, what does he go on to say to him? He says, well, before that, he says, Simon, son of Jonah, flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you, but my Father which is in heaven, remember? Simon, son of Jonah, Simon Bar Jonah, Simon, son of Jonah, probably spelled Jona. I'll look it up real quickly. If it is, it really should, be the full form. Oh, we're even given it, it's different. I'm thinking of another passage over in John 1 where it says Simon, son of Jonah. Yes, it's spelled Jona, but here we're actually left with the Aramaic connection, Simon Bar Jonah. Remember, Bain is the Hebrew term for son. Bar is the Aramaic term, hence bar mitzvah, son of the commandment, a Hebrew term and an Aramaic term. Mitzvah, the commandment, and bar, Aramaic for son. Simon Bar Jonah. Well, here's a good verse. Now we turn to it, so you've got it. Matthew chapter 16 and verse 17. One way to distinguish, because there would be many people by the name of Simon. Notice he wasn't called after his father. Maybe he was called after another relative, though. It didn't have to be after the father. According to Luke 1, it could be just a kinsman, like an uncle or a grandfather, something like that. Simon Bar Jonah. He distinguishes Simon from maybe other Simons with this phrase, Bar Jonah, son of Jonah. So here's one way of differentiation by one's father.
For the continuation of this message.
Simon Bar Jonah. He distinguishes Simon from maybe other Simons with this phrase, Bar Jonah, son of Jonah. So here's one way of differentiation by one's father. Okay, let's get another one while we're in Matthew 4, verses 21 and 22. If you've never thought of this, then you'll read names differently in Scripture then. And what I'm not getting off into is the Hebrew concept of naming a child, which I think most of us, if you've even been to maybe one charismatic meeting or even one denominational meeting, you hear somewhere along the line about names, that Hebrews didn't just name people like Americans name their children, but they generally wait like an Indian would wait and see some type of characteristic that would manifest itself in this child. Or maybe if you were born, during a full moon, the Indians then would name you Moonlight, and that'd be your name, Moonlight or something. Or you're born early in the morning, and the only thing you could see in the heavens was the morning star. What was your name? Morning Star. Or you'd get some funny names like Sitting Bull or Crazy Horse. But that also was dependent on, maybe like riding, if you study the life of Crazy Horse, riding a horse in a crazy fashion. Sitting Bull, maybe he sat on a bull. I haven't read about his life. But it was named, they were named after some event. You didn't just think, all right, Thomas, that's just a great name. I like the name Thomas. It doesn't have too many letters, so you always have to fill out these forms. Don't give your son the name Bartholomew or Nebuchadnezzar, because it never fits in the spaces there. So we think it's got to fit in the spaces. 5 letters, maybe 6 letters, and especially if you have a long name. If you have a long last name, then give them a short first name to make sure it all fits on the line there. Well, they didn't have to think of things like that. They would go by characteristics, personality, the seasons during which one was born, maybe the setting. Tamar means a palm tree. Maybe it's because as they saw her, or maybe it was an expression. Many times it was an expression of faith or hope for their child, that this young girl here, Tamar, will grow up as straight, morally and ethically and so forth, as straight as the palm tree. Palm trees had roots that went down very, very, very deep, a big, big, big taproot that would go down deeper. That's why you find them out in the desert, you see. And so we're hoping that she'll be rooted and grounded in her religious traditions or something. And so you would name a child after that. So that's what we're not getting into. I think I just got into it. But I said we're not getting into that because we'll study that more in detail later. We'll look at some of these other concepts. We're just discussing the subject of differentiation. What verses did I say? 21? Going on from thence, he saw other 2 brethren. Okay, watch this. Now, you're familiar with this from Sunday school. But there was a reason. I mean, you're not, every time someone refers to you, they don't say Thomas, the son of Mike, do they? They don't refer to you like that. They say Thomas Smith. Thomas J. Smith. Not Thomas, the son of Mike. I'm never introduced as Chino, the son of Ralph. It's always Chino Ross, Brother Ross, whatever. It's never the son of. We're in a different culture now, a different society. That's my father's name, by the way. That's one of those old American names. You don't have too many. I can't picture a little 1-year-old Ralph. But back in their days, my mother has a name similar to that. I won't tell you what it is, but it's a good name because means forest, means dark forest. Sylvia comes from an interesting origin. Going on from this, you know what a sylph is, don't you? A slender woman. A sylph is a slender woman, but it has other connotations. Going on from thence, he saw other two brethren, James, and all we have here is of Zebedee, the son is supplied, the son. You notice it's italicized. James of Zebedee. That means that he came of Zebedee. Well, if he came of Zebedee, that means that he begat you, as King James says, so you're his son. He's your father. James, the son of Zebedee. Now, there are many people by the name of James. How are we going to distinguish this James? By his father's name, Zebedee. James, the son of Zebedee. And what about John? Well, John is his brother. And so John is the brother of James, who is the son of Zebedee. So now we know which John we're talking about here. He's got a brother named James and a father named Zebedee. In one sense, it was more difficult. You had to remember all the family tree to make sure you know that you're talking about the right person here. Now you just have to know the first name, the last name. Then you had to know the family tree, how he was connected to other people. If you just knew John, many Johns. He's got a brother named James. Well, there are many Johns who have a brother named James. But this brother named James has a father whose name is Zebedee. Oh, now we know who you're talking about then. Or maybe his father, whose name is Zebedee, has an uncle whose name is Zerubbabel. Oh, now we know, because we know many Johns who have a brother named James who have a father together named Zebedee. But here's the only one we've ever heard of with an uncle named Zerubbabel. So now we know that we're talking about the same person here. So this is the way they were known. Acts chapter 1 and verse 13, which will be the same as Luke 6:16. This is interesting, you see, to study this little tidbit of information here. Amen. These names are important in Scripture, important in the Old Testament and important in the New. Names for us, you see, are just they're just something that's on your birth certificate. They generally don't mean anything, you see. And of course, that's why we have our understanding, because it's a 100% biblical understanding, although I've had to write a letter or two trying to discuss this matter with someone who just can't quite grasp it. They're not fighting it, they're just trying to grasp it. That's why we have our understanding that we do about praying in Jesus' name. It's not just J-E-S-U-S. It represents something else. Because many people are called Jesus. Many people are called that in Latin America today. So it couldn't be something in those letters right there. It has to be something deeper, a deeper significance there.
Amen.
Okay, let's work our way through verse 13, because we have names piled upon names. When they were come in, they went into an upper room where abode both Peter and James and John. We're familiar with all of these, you see. Luke knows that just from the Gospels. These are some of the more outstanding ones here. Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, James of Alphaeus. James of Alphaeus. James the son, italicized, of Alphaeus. He's sometimes referred to as James the Less. James, that's what we call him now in church history and church writings, James the Less. Because James the Greater is, remember, one of the important disciples of Peter, James, and John. Those are the three important disciples, Peter, James, and John. There's a James there, Peter, James, and John. He's James the Greater. Here's James the Less. Well, that's what we call him today. They called him, to distinguish him from the other James, James of Alphaeus, Simon Zelotes, and Judas. Again, the construction is the same, Judas of James. And so for some mysterious reason, the King James gave us the brother. And probably the NIV will give you son, because that's always understood in these connections. You weren't really known by your brother. You were known as the son of a certain man. You were known by your father. Does it give that? It says son of. It doesn't say brother of, right? All right. See, you need to scratch that brother out and put son in. People weren't known by their brothers. You had to be someone higher up than a brother, and that was a father, the one who begat you, as King James says. So that should read, and the only way we know it should read that is just from cultural studies. You don't know it from the Greek. The Greek says nothing. The Greek just says Judas of James. But it really wouldn't make sense even with that. Somehow Judas came of James. Well, he couldn't have if they were brothers. But if one's a father and the other's a son, then we could say Judas of. It's understood he came of James, which would mean James is his father, which would mean he would be James' son. Judas, the son of James. Okay, Judas is just the Greek form of Judah. And then in Luke 6:16, we have the same problem here that needs to be corrected in the King James Version. Same individual, as a matter of fact, spoken of. Judas of James. King James, for some unbeknownst reason, gave us the brother. Y'all following that now? It's not brother, it's son. Judas, the son of James. And they even give us a marginal reading to Jude 1, but that's an entirely different Jude. Jude, Judas, Judah are all the same name, you see. And that's an entirely different Jude, so my Bible has that marginal reference stricken out. Most of your marginal cross-references are fairly good and reliable. They're helpful to look up something, but you don't want to turn to Jude to look up Judas, the son of James, because you'll find a different Judas over there. He's called Jude. He's the Lord's half-brother. And he's the brother of James the Greater, which is the other James, which is the one who wrote the little epistle of James. See, many James and Judes and Judas and Simons and all of this. And I think we're even going to find another Judas right here in this verse. And Judas Iscariot. Now, not chariot, Iscariot. Now, what does that mean? Well, we'll get to that. That's another way to distinguish a person. We have to distinguish him because there's so many people by the name Judas. In this verse, we've got two. Judas, and he's distinguished one way in verse 16, the son of James, and now Judas, and he's distinguished another way, Iscariot, as well as another way, the infamous way in the New Testament, which also was the traitor. So we'll know we've got the correct Judah, Judas, or Jude there. All right, let's see. Why don't we look up Jude 1:1 while we're here? Here is a reference where someone goes by their brother. So maybe I just need to clarify this, since I just mentioned a moment ago people really weren't known by their brothers. If you're going to be known by your brother here in the New Testament, it's going to have to be clearly stated. You can't have it all italicized there. It has to be clearly stated. And I'll tell you the reason why this Jude was known by his brother. Number one, his father was dead and had been dead for many years. By the way, this is the same father as Jesus had. That is a natural father. His father had been dead for many years. And what was his name? Joseph. Many Josephs also, remember. But his father had been dead for many years, so you're not going to still be known by your father. And more importantly, his brother James happens to be one of the most important members in the Jerusalem Christian community. He was really the leader, the apostle who was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. So he is known as Jude. It's the exact same thing now as Judah or Judas, the slave, literally, of Jesus Christ and brother of James. Notice it's not italicized here. They give it for us because this is important here. The brother of James. Now, Jude says that of James. What does James say? Let's turn over to James' epistle. Does James say a slave of Jesus Christ, the brother of Jude? No, because Jude was hardly known in comparison to his brother James. James was much better known. So you're not going to be known by a lesser known brother of yours. Watch this in James 1:1. James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. No reference to his brother Jude. Jude refers to him because James is the better known of the two. He's known by his brother here because his father is dead and because his brother is one of the most important people in Palestine for many years of the 1st century A.D. So that's kind of an exception where one is known by his brother. Although others can be known by their brother, like John, we saw in Matthew chapter 4, verses 21 and 22, John was known as the brother of James, who in turn was known as the son of Zebedee. Okay, if I haven't lost you yet, let's jump to John. I think this is what we need. John chapter 1. We're going to have many things here. John 1. We'll start with verse 35. We're still just on our first point here, that they were distinguished by their father. Again, the next day after John stood. Now, which John are we talking about here? Look up at the very top of your page there. The title of the book. John. There's a John writing this book. This must be John the Baptist. But isn't he always referred to in the other Gospels as John the Baptist? Here he's called John. Why? Well, because this author never refers to himself by his personal proper name, John. Therefore, any reference to John would have to be to the only other important John in his train of thought, and that's John the Baptist. So you see, we're back to this whole subject of name. It's very complicated. It's easy to understand once you know it. If you don't know it, it's very complicated why he's referred to as John Baptist or John the Baptist in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You get over to the Gospel of John, now he's simply known as John. And of all things, we're in the Gospel of John. But there was never a problem with them because John, in his writing of his own Gospel, never refers to himself by his proper name. If he refers to himself at all, it's with titles like that other disciple, or the one who leaned on Jesus' breath, or that disciple whom Jesus loved. He gave himself cryptic descriptions in his Gospel, assuming that those even refer to him. And I think we might even find one here. I'll keep reading and we'll find out together whether we find one. Looking upon Jesus as he walked, he saith, Behold the Lamb of God. There's two disciples. Notice let's get back to verse 35. John stood and two of his disciples, two of the disciples of the Baptist. The two disciples heard him speak. Heard John Baptist say what he said in verse 36, Behold the Lamb of God, and so 37b, they followed him. Then Jesus turned and saw them following, and saith unto them, What seek ye? And they said unto him, Rabbi, which is to say, being interpreted, Teacher, Master, where dwellest thou? He saith unto them, Come and see. They came and saw where he dwelt, and abode with him that day. It was about the 10th hour. One of the two which heard John speak and followed him was Andrew. One of the two was Andrew. Who was the other one? Probably the author of the Gospel here, because he makes a very obvious point throughout his Gospel to refer to himself, but never to name himself, though. He always is referring to himself, but he never names himself. And so it's been believed for many years, down through church history, that the other unnamed disciple is what we know now as the Apostle John, who wrote this Gospel. But anyway, that's speculation. We're not told here. I think it's more than speculation. I think it's built on an internal understanding of the Gospel of John, how he goes about referring to himself. You know enough, don't you, to know that he refers to himself by things like the one who leaned on Jesus' breast, or the disciple that Jesus loved, the beloved disciple. Okay, so one of these which followed him was Andrew, and look what it says after that. Now, which Andrew are we talking about? Simon Peter's brother. Now, look at that double name, Simon Peter. Now, how do you end up with a double name like that? I said they didn't have double names. See, everything is a name here in the New Testament. The same is true in the Old. We're just looking at the New. Okay, Andrew may have even been better known than Peter. So John is writing not from the point of view of what happened this day, but from the point of view of what happened in church history, that Simon Peter became the better known of the two. And by the way, Simon Peter doesn't even have that name until down in verse 42. He's not referred to as Simon Peter. He doesn't have that double name. He's known by Simon, but not by Peter, until we get to verse 42. And see, critics love that. They say, see, John made a mistake by referring to him in verse 40 as Simon Peter, since he's not even given the name Peter until verse 42. Well, John is writing what we speak of as proleptically. He's writing proleptically here because any fool can jump down to verse 42 and see he's going to be named there. And whenever John's writing his gospel, John is not writing on the day of John chapter 1 and verse 40. He's writing decades after that. And what's Simon been known as for all these decades of history? Simon Peter. Simon Peter. John knows his name really, officially, originally was Simon, but for decades now he has been known as Simon Peter. So he just refers to him that way. We have the same situation where after the resurrection, we're told that Jesus appeared to the 12. Now, did you catch that? What's the problem with that? There was only 11. Why only 11? Judas was gone. And Paul hadn't been picked yet. And neither had the apostle over in Acts chapter 1. And yet he appeared to the 12. Well, any fool who reads the Bible, again, the critics jump on that and say, see, someone didn't know that Judas had killed himself. Well, anybody knew that Judas had killed himself. But it had just become the established thing to speak of the 12. And just because now one of them is missing, you still call them the 12. How many times is a company named something, and then maybe something changes in the company so that the name is really shouldn't be that anymore? I think that's happened right here in this church, has it not? And you still call them by the same company name, right? Now, maybe one of the partners is gone now. Well, we all realize that, you see. It's not that we have made an anachronistic chronological mistake here. We all realize that, but you go on with the same company name there. That just happens all the time. And the same thing happened with the 12, although there were really technically 11 of them. Okay. See, we're giving you all types of tidbits. Here, I thought we were going to get way down through morals, maybe into economics tonight. I don't even think we're going to get through with names here. 45 minutes already on this one point. Well, I've never claimed to have a gift of talking, but I'm convincing myself more and more through the years I must have it. But at least I'm saying something when I'm talking, though. We're skipping around from verse to verse and point to point. Problem is, I know too much, and then you try to make a statement, and you think, well, now, wait a minute, then you got to say this, too, because you want to make sure this is understood over there. And I didn't study a lot before I came tonight. That's always a sign. Sometimes it's a sign I study too much if I talk too much. I didn't study much on this. I'm glad I didn't. So he first findeth his own brother Simon. That was his name. See, he was called Simon Peter in 40. Now he's called Simon. Saith unto him, we found the Mashiach, the Messiah, Messias for the Greek here, which is being interpreted the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus, and when Jesus beheld him, he said, Thou art Simon, the son of Jonah. Uh-oh, we missed an H there in the Greek now. Or Jonas would really be the Greek form. Thou art Simon. Now we saw in Matthew 16 it was Simon Bar-Jonah, remember. He left us with part of the Aramaic. Here he didn't leave us with the Aramaic. Thou art Simon the son of Jonah. Okay, how was he known then? Simon, son of Jonah. Again, we're finding another reference here. Simon, son of Jonah. And then I think we'll probably come back to John 1 at some later time. Well, I haven't exhausted the issue yet. 1 Kings 4, verses 7 through 19. We're still on the fact they were distinguished by their father. 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 7 through 19. We may have even mentioned this. I have some reference way back in my mind that I told you about this. Probably it was an Old Testament introduction. Solomon had 12 officers over Israel. And here are their names, verse 8. All right, now how would you like this name? Here's your name, the son of Hur. Well, that's no name. But you see they were known by their father, the son of Hur. Hur was known. And if you want to give the Hebrew, then you get the margin. And then you get movies named after that, Ben-Hur. See how knowing the Scriptures helps you know so much about so many different things. Who would have ever found, right here in this little margin, way back in that dusty, filled with cobwebs Old Testament, 1 Kings 4, verse 8, Ben-Hur. Well, there it is. Ben, or Bain, remember, is the Hebrew term for son. The son of Hur. And King James is inconsistent here. Sometimes they give us son of and then give us Ben someone in the margin, and sometimes they give us son of and don't give us any Bens in the margin, though. So here's probably the best place, although it's kind of an obscure place. People were known by their father's name. So here's the first man. His name, I'm going to introduce you. Who is this? This is son of Hur. Verse 9, this is son of Dekar. Verse 10, this is son of Hesed. We're not told his name, except that is his name, the son of Hesed. Verse 11, son of Abinadab. Verse 13, son of Geber. For all those you have 8, 9, 10, 11, 13 in the margin, Ben. But then sometimes, like verse 12, they're not consistent. Baana, the son of Ahilud. Why not Baana ben Ahihud then? Ahilud. But they're inconsistent. They don't give us the bens or the banes over in the margin. All right, so enough on that. People were known by their father's name. Never fear if your name is James or Judas or Simon. You can always go by your father's name, which will give you two names then. Okay, another way in which one could be distinguished, and I'm going to give a something hyphen something, just so I don't have to get into the disputes and questions about this. You could be known by your political associations, or, if we would rather interpret this word a different way, by your religious state. Let's just say that, and I'll show you what I mean, and I say that to be safe so I don't have to get into this issue. Among other places, this is Acts 1:13 again. Acts 1:13. Someone read it through quickly to yourself and pick out which man we're talking about here. Either by your political attachments or by your spiritual state. Simon Zelotes. Simon Zelotes. Now, don't ever let these things confuse you as though someone has a first and a last name. His name is not Mr. Zelotes, Simon Zelotes. Those are just two first names, Simon Zelotes. But there are many Simons. One of them is Simon Peter. Here's another Simon. He has to be distinguished from that one. He's distinguished many times in the New Testament, or several times, let me say, because he doesn't appear that many times. He's distinguished as Simon Zelotes. Well, remember there was a Jewish band known as the Zealots, a political Jewish band known as the Zealots, whose mission in life was to overthrow the Roman government. And some people believe that's the origin for the term Zelotes. He was Simon the Zealot. Maybe that's the way an NIV or something would have it. Instead of this Zelotes here, he was Simon the Zealot. Or if that's not the correct interpretation, and I'm really not even going to give my judgment on it right now because it doesn't matter. It's not important. It'd be important if we're studying the Zealots as a political party, you see, to know whether or not Jesus had recruited a former zealot to be now an apostle of his. Or it could have reference to his spiritual state, and by that I mean he was extremely zealous after God. That's another interpretation. I think politics is the one I see most of the time. I'm not saying I believe that, I'm just saying that's what I see most of the time. So I'm kind of leaving that. That's why I put that first, politics first. Maybe, as some people believe, this is a political reference. Simon the Zealot. Now, of course, he's not a zealot anymore, except as an apostolic zealot for the ministry of Jesus Christ. But he formerly was a zealot, recruited by Jesus to be an apostle, if that interpretation is true. Okay, let's move on to another reference. They could be distinguished by occupation, by their occupation. I guess the one that comes to my mind in the very first place would be John the Baptist. He was a baptizer. Many people by the name of John. So how do we know this one? Well, he's the Baptist. No one else was baptizing like he was, whose name was John anyway. So there's one who's known by occupation, John Baptist. And really that's the way he's generally referred to, not as John the Baptist, just as John Baptist. But his last name is not Baptist, so. Oh, we get a lot of these over in Acts. So let's start in Acts chapter 9, and let's go to another Simon. Now, I don't know how many Simons we've already looked at here. Some known by their father, Simon Bar-Jonah. maybe by a new name, Simon Peter. We'll get to that later. Peter's just a new name. That's another way to be distinguished. By political attachment, Simon Zelotes, assuming that's the correct interpretation. Or by occupation, Simon, Acts 9:43, a tanner. Now, a tanner is one who tanned skins. And what all that involved will work out in that other class I said I already have worked up. Came to pass that he, who's the he of Acts 9:43? Who's the he of Acts 9:43? Came to pass that he. No. Peter. Well, but who is that though? Simon. It came to pass that Simon tarried many days in Joppa with one Simon. So we're going to have to work it out. Simon Peter, Simon Bar-Jonah, Simon Cephas, something like that. And then here's how we're going to work out the other man, Simon a tanner. Acts 9:43. Simon a tanner. Chapter 16 and verse 14. And a certain woman, now we're into women's names. We don't discuss those too much because they don't appear as often as the men. A certain woman named Lydia, and she's known by her occupation, a seller of purple dye probably, of the city of Thyatira. She also is known by city. We'll get to that later on. See, many times we're having overlapping here because they're known by several different ways. Simon Peter is known by Simon Bar-Jonah as well as Simon Peter, as well as Simon, Andrew's brother. And Andrew also was Andrew Bar-Jonah. So Lydia is known as the seller of purple. Chapter 18 and verse 3. We are not told a specific name, such and such, who did some occupation, but notice how important occupations were. Because he was of the same craft, he abode with them and wrought, for they were by their occupation. They were by their occupation tent makers. So you could be known as Paul, the tent maker. Aquila, the tent maker. Prisca or Priscilla, the woman married to Aquila, the tent maker. And so you might have many people named Paul or Saul and many people named Aquila. There were other people named Aquila. Remember, we have an Aquila who gave us one Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament.
This message will be continued on